A lone voice questioned its location, adrift in an endless, impenetrable darkness. Slowly, the sound of distant voices began to pierce the silence, echoing from afar. It seemed a group of noblewomen were gossiping about the king's gaze upon the crown prince, describing it as a truly spine-chilling sight. One woman reasoned that no father truly wishes to harm his son, suggesting that as the future ruler of the Hubard Empire, the prince was merely receiving a particularly stern form of royal affection. The disembodied voice questioned its own hearing. These people were speaking of empires and using names straight out of fiction. Another lady chimed in, remarking that regardless, the prince had matured significantly since their last encounter, now possessing the stature of a full-grown man. She lamented with a sigh what a pity it was that Queen Elise couldn't witness his transformation. That name, Elise, ignited a spark of recognition in her mind, and suddenly, everything clicked into place. She had to be inside the world of the novel she had just finished reading. Her last memory was of being struck by a truck as she dashed into the street to save a cat. It seemed that truck had sent her straight into this new reality. With a sense of elation, she bid farewell to her miserable former life. Perhaps the cat she rescued, in her final moments, had granted her this incredible fortune. Knowing the novel's entire plot by heart, it hardly mattered which character she had become. Her future success was practically guaranteed. She began to ponder whose body she now inhabited, perhaps a chic villainess or the refined daughter of a noble house. A wealthy upbringing would certainly simplify things, though even the life of a simple country girl had its own appeal. She reflected on the hardships of her previous existence and resolved that in this new life, she would indulge in absolute luxury. As she was lost in this daydream, a young boy emerged from behind a cluster of bushes. He extended his hand and seized something nearby. In her confusion, she felt her own body being lifted from the ground. A wave of panic washed over her as she tried to speak, but only a faint meow escaped. The sound stunned her into a horrifying realization. She had assumed she would be the heroine, or at the very least, the antagonist. She would have even accepted being a minor character, or a faceless extra. But no, she wasn't even human. As the boy gazed down at her, the truth became undeniable. She was now a tiny kitten, small enough to fit in his palm. Her hands were now paws, covered in soft, white fur, or rather, her front paws. She recalled that in her old world, cats were universally adored, but in the world of this novel, the sentiment was tragically different. The novel was titled Souls Devoured by Darkness. She'd read the tragic tale at a friend's urging, a story where the female lead's obsessive psychosis towards the male protagonist was depicted in excruciating detail. It was the sort of narrative that both captivated and deeply unsettled its readers. Despite this, she remembered cheering for them to find happiness together, and she recalled the world's lore perfectly. Hurt was the largest empire on the Dear Continent, and it was the very place where Syian Gunther Reinhardt, the male lead, was destined to become emperor. At the empire's founding, an ancient priest had issued a prophecy that cursed felines would bring about its ruin to the entire empire. As a result, the populace began to hunt these creatures relentlessly. Fearful citizens scoured every corner of the land, eradicating every cat they could locate. Centuries went by, and now not a single whisker could be found within the kingdom's borders. The prophecy was seemingly fulfilled, and the empire enjoyed an era of peace and prosperity. So, naturally, with this knowledge, she had been reincarnated as a cat. In Hubard, children were conditioned from birth to believe that cats were malevolent beings that must be eliminated on sight. Now, trembling in the boy's grasp, she was certain her second life was about to end. At that very moment, a group of soldiers approached, inquiring if His Majesty was all right. He calmly replied in the negative, dismissing them by stating he felt unwell and that the hunt should be postponed. They acknowledged his command and departed. Still held in the boy's hand, the tiny kitten had no lingering doubts. His appearance matched the novel's description flawlessly. Within Hubard, only those of royal blood possessed red eyes. And among the royals, only one person could have inherited Queen Elisa's signature raven-black hair. The impossibly handsome young man holding her could only be one individual, Syian Gunther Reinhardt, the crown prince of the Hubard Empire. He was infamous in the story as the most ruthless tyrant in history. And now, knowing the prophecy as he did, her fate was sealed. The moment he identified her as a cat, he was about to end her life, and a wave of injustice washed over her. She had played no part in the cat-rot devastation that plagued the Empire's history. In truth, she was merely an unfortunate human, one who had perished while trying to save a feline. Desperately, she attempted to convey this truth to His Majesty that this small, furry form housed the spirit of a person. However, it turned out that communicating as a cat was an insurmountable challenge. Listening to the incessant meows from the creature in his palm, the prince couldn't help but wonder what it was trying so desperately to express. With a thoughtful expression, the young man simply identified the animal as a cat. The sheer obviousness of his statement was staggering. Frozen in place, the tiny feline came to a sudden realization. Perhaps he had never actually laid eyes on one before. His only knowledge of cats likely came from drawings and illustrations, given they were believed to be entirely extinct within the Empire. She frantically tried to communicate that she held the key to the Empire's future, to its impending downfall. Yet, despite her efforts, her warnings were lost in a flurry of frantic meows. The prince continued to stare, a shadow now crossing his features. Abruptly, she felt a soft landing and discovered she had been placed inside the prince's pocket, leaving her to wonder what on earth he was planning. Now, inside the palace, the sound of his footsteps echoed as she tried to guess his destination, her anxiety mounting with every step. Blind to the world outside, she feared the worst. Perhaps he wasn't taking her to a garden, but to a more private location for the grim deed. A hand reached in for her and set her gently upon a table. As he took a seat opposite her, she braced herself for the end. The prince then remarked that this creature looked quite different from the descriptions in the books. Her teeth, he noted, barely extended past her chin, and her claws seemed utterly harmless. He mused aloud if this was simply because she was just a kitten. Our protagonist silently fumed. What in the world did these people think cats were? As the prince gently prodded her, he added that despite these discrepancies, the books had been correct about one thing. This creature possessed a talent for concealing its malevolent nature behind a facade of cuteness to deceive humans. He observed her trembling uncontrollably as his gaze remained intense and unwavering. He conceded that it made sense why people would find cats so adorable. The comment left the girl utterly stunned. Syian continued to stare pensively at the small feline before him. He then extended his hand, asking her to offer a paw. She complied. Next, he instructed her to roll over, and then to give him a high five. His final request was for her to bite his finger. This command made her recoil. Was this a test? Was he simply searching for an excuse to end her life? After a moment's hesitation, she approached his hand and nipped him with extreme gentleness, more of a soft pressure than a bite. Syian gazed at his finger in silence before remarking on how peculiar it was. He confessed it felt as though this animal understood every word he said, which, he added, would make her the only living creature who actually did. While the dinner table was being prepared, the prince pondered what sort of food he ought to offer the small creature before him. The kitten, meanwhile, bristled at being called this thing. Did he truly see her as nothing more than an object? Regardless, it appeared he had decided against killing her, at least for the moment, given that he was considering her dinner. As he poured some milk into a saucer, the girl mused that, for a cat prophesied to bring about the Empire's ruin, she was incredibly fortunate to still be breathing. The prince looked to be about 18 or 19 years old. She recalled from the novel that his coronation took place shortly after he came of age. That was the very moment the story truly began. It dawned on her that she had arrived in the timeline just before the novel's plot was set in motion. He placed the dish down in front of her and encouraged her to eat. Despite her stomach rumbling with hunger, she recalled that milk processed for humans could give cats an upset stomach. Nevertheless, she ultimately decided to drink it. To her astonishment, the milk was absolutely divine. Casting aside all remnants of her human dignity, she began to lap it up as if it were her last meal. Picking up a napkin, the prince commented that while everyone claimed cats were clever and cruel, the one before him just looked like a pathetic, sloppy little thing. As he gently cleaned her face, he remarked that she was so fragile, he felt he could break her by mistake. The kitten wondered if that was intended to be some sort of insult. As he continued to gaze at her, Syian questioned how a creature so minuscule could possibly pose a threat to anyone. On the verge of tears, our protagonist thought, "That is precisely the point I have been trying to make." Just then, a knock came from the door, and a voice called out to His Majesty, apologizing for the intrusion. The prince paused for a brief moment before the door swung open. In a swift motion, he snatched the kitten and concealed her within the pocket of his coat, tucking her safely out of sight. She understood his need for haste, but was such roughness truly necessary? That infuriating prince. Just then, a voice cut through the air, inquiring if they had disturbed his meal. A young woman addressed the prince, explaining that she had come to offer her personal thanks, having heard that His Majesty enjoyed the meal she'd prepared the day before. The woman, whose jawline was as sharp as an isosceles triangle, continued, expressing her relief. She had been worried about his poor appetite, but was delighted to learn he'd consumed the food she made for him. Tucked away in his pocket, she overheard something that sparked a familiar, unsettling memory from the novel. A woman insistent on preparing every meal. The lady then urged the prince to enjoy today's meal as well, emphasizing the great effort she had poured into its preparation. As that soft, delicate voice reached her ears, a memory surfaced. There was only one person who would be so persistent in feeding Syian, someone whose ambition was a hunger that would stop at nothing. The villainous countess, Catherine Harmon Gisela. She recalled from the original novel how Catherine had charmed Syian's father, the emperor, ultimately securing her place on the throne as his empress. Catherine's voice feigned concern as she asked if the prince had lost his appetite once more. This was the very woman who, at a mere 20 years old, had been gifted the entire state of Gisela by the smitten emperor. She remembered how the novel's hero had struggled against Catherine, a formidable opponent due to her sharp intellect and vast influence. As the kitten became lost, in these recollections, Catherine's voice droned on, describing the day's menu. Tender lamb seasoned with salt and pepper, accompanied by a rich sauce crafted from a premium wine, hailing from the Bordeaux region. This culinary display was merely the start of her grand design. After all, Catherine was already using dark magic potions on the emperor, and now she was trying to get Syian to eat, as she insisted the meat must not grow cold, lest it lose its exquisite flavor and become tough. She pressed him to take at least a single bite, especially since she had poured so much effort into it. And just as she did with the emperor, Catherine had tainted the prince's food. The novel detailed how, bit by bit, Syian would be poisoned by her concoction, transforming him into a compliant puppet for her to control when he ascended the throne. She then added with false sympathy that she couldn't bear to leave him alone, promising to wait until he finished eating before she would depart. Clearly irritated, Syian finally snapped, asking if consuming her offering would finally grant him some peace and put an end to this charade. After a brief hesitation, Catherine explained that His Majesty himself had ordered her to ensure Syian ate well, claiming she was merely following his command. Trapped by her words, and realizing she had him cornered, he sighed in resignation and relented. Inside the pocket, a wave of panic washed over her. Wait, just a second. Was he actually reaching for the spoon? She knew there was absolutely no way she could allow the prince to ingest anything made by that woman. Left with no alternative, she resorted to her only weapon, frantically scratching at the fabric of the prince's pocket. Syian flinched, startled by the sudden movement inside his coat. "Is something amiss?" the countess inquired. The prince held up a hand, telling her to wait a moment, as he reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the small kitten. But her resolve was firm. She continued to scratch, desperately trying to convey the danger in the food. And though she envisioned catastrophic consequences for him, his mind clouded and his future ruined. The only sound that escaped her was a small, pitiful meow. As he withdrew his hand from the pocket, a long, angry scratch was visible across his skin. "I've had enough of this," the prince declared, his patience gone. He pointed out that his father was not the sort of man to fuss over his eating habits, and furthermore, he had no appetite. Putting on a show of concern, Catherine suggested that he must not be feeling well, and graciously offered to let him rest. The moment the door clicked shut, Syian's attention snapped back to his pocket. His expression hardened as he quickly searched for the kitten. Placing her on the table, he saw her sitting with her head bowed in shame. The prince then quietly asked if he could see the scratches she'd given him. She had no idea what to do. It was bizarre enough simply being a cat in this world, but now she had attacked royalty during a meal. There was surely no escaping the consequences this time. She let out a series of desperate meows, a frantic attempt to explain her actions. But it was useless. She knew Syian couldn't understand her. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended between them. The prince simply stared as the tiny kitten trembled in fear. On the verge of tears, a single thought consumed her. This is it. This is how I die. Under his unblinking gaze, She was frozen solid. A part of her wondered if she should have just let him eat the tainted food and focused on her own escape later. But she immediately dismissed the thought. No, that wouldn't sit right with her conscience. She could never live with herself if she knowingly let someone be ensnared by something as vile as that cursed substance. Preventing that was what mattered most. From unfolding. She could never permit him to consume anything prepared by Countess Gisela again. Just then, the prince gently stroked her head, asking if she had been terrified while tucked away inside his pocket, adding that if she were to stay out, she must refrain from scratching him like that again. The protagonist felt an immense wave of relief wash over her. In spite of his fearsome expression, the prince was only giving her a mild caution, the equivalent of a yellow card. Picking up his fork, Syian announced his intention to resume his meal. A jolt of panic shot through the kitten as she scrambled to find a way to stop him. And finally, an idea struck. Crying out with a loud meow, she dug her claws into the tablecloth, which only served to confuse the prince about her bizarre behavior. Realizing she had just made things profoundly stranger and put Syian on edge, she desperately wondered what to do. In the end, she resolved to risk it all and employ the universal language of all creatures, body language. She began to gesture wildly, miming the stark message that if he ate the food, he would perish. Puzzled, the prince asked if the cat was attempting to prevent him from eating. Elated, the girl meowed in confirmation. Feeling as though he were losing his mind while conversing with a cat, Syian asked for the specific reason he should avoid this particular dish. All he received in reply were more frantic meows. Giving up, he reasoned that perhaps the kitten had sensed something. Based on her performance, if he ate it, he would become ill and collapse, which sounded an awful lot like poison. The prince declared that this made no sense whatsoever. After all, how could a cat possibly be aware of such a thing? The girl thought, because I am a human soul within this cat's body. She then wondered what would have become of her if she were truly just an ordinary cat in this world, and not a reincarnated person. As a simple animal, how in the world would she ever survive here? Despite that grim consideration, she forced herself to remain hopeful. First, she was in close proximity to the crown prince, so being harmed right now was highly improbable. In a fleeting daydream, she envisioned a future by the prince's side, while also contemplating how she might become human again. She decided to leverage the full, undeniable charm of the tiny feline body she now inhabited. For a second, Syian froze, before a smile touched his lips. "This is rather amusing," the prince said, and the kitten was left utterly stunned. He actually smiled. Just then, a knock echoed at the door, announcing that a decree from the emperor had arrived, requiring the prince's presence at the second library immediately. Syian's entire aura shifted in an instant. That pleasant smile was replaced by a cold, foreboding expression. With the lights turned low, the kitten lay upon the prince's bed, waiting in the heavy silence. She found the room dreadfully dull, as if it lacked any trace of personality. But then, Syian did spend most of his days at the academy, which explained why his room felt so lifeless. He was rarely ever at the palace. Before he had departed, Syian had instructed her not to leave the room, saying she could use anything inside to occupy herself. But that was all. And so, in the present, she waited, feeling dejected, assuming the prince had rushed to the emperor and forgotten all about her. A short time later, Syian's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he finally returned to his room. As he shed his coat, his body revealed a map of scars, and he then proceeded directly to the bath. With a hollow, vacant expression, he washed himself, his skin now marred by blood, bruises, and fresh wounds. After drying his hair, he walked toward the bed and saw the kitten was still there. Syian praised her for remaining so quiet, stroking her gently. As he lay down, he told her he was going to sleep and that she should take care to stay on the bed and not fall. But then, the kitten noticed something was wrong. The prince's scent had changed. She could now detect the smell of blood. She recalled from the original novel that the emperor had subjected him to brutal discipline since childhood. That was likely the true reason for the earlier summons. The girl thought, to herself, "Honestly, I always wondered why male leads in these fantasy stories were so stoic. I figured it was just to make them seem cooler." She had once considered Syian's past to be a tired old cliché, but now, witnessing the consequences firsthand, it was a much harder truth to accept. To simply dismiss it as part of the plot felt inherently wrong now that it was happening right before her very eyes. And in this moment, the scent of blood and the cold night air were painfully, undeniably real. She walked toward in his hand, wondering if there was anything at all she could do. She just wanted to offer him some kind of comfort. Syian shifted restlessly and then awoke with a start, thinking he had. He thought it was just another nightmare, but something jolted him from his sleep. Instead of the kitten beside him, he awoke to an utter shock. Lying in his arms, right there in his bed, was a silver-haired woman, completely unclothed. A wave of shock sent the prince bolting upright as his eyes darted to the side, realizing something was terribly wrong. The cat was gone, and in its place, this woman now lay. His mind jumped to a single horrifying conclusion. The kitten he was meant to be protecting had simply vanished. This was the very first time he had ever seen a real cat, a creature he'd previously only known from illustrations. A dark thought crept in. Maybe killing it back then would have been the wiser choice. He remembered drawing his sword, only to hesitate. For some inexplicable reason, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Firstly, how could such a cat even exist, if they were all supposedly extinct? And more bafflingly, how had one appeared in the palace gardens in this era? Secondly, he recalled that even though she was just an animal, she clearly understood human language whenever he petted her. And despite looking so small and frail, barely able to protect herself, the kitten had still tried to prevent the prince from eating the poisoned food. On top of all that, she had waited for him quietly in his room, keeping him company until he finally fell asleep. So this cat, regardless of the dangerous legends about her kind, belonged to him. Syian was certain of it. Standing there and staring down at the woman, he decided that if she had dared to lay a hand on his property, whoever she was, Syian would show her no forgiveness. Seething with irritation, he shouted at the woman to wake up, but only silence answered him as she slept like a stone. Furious, Syian reached for her, and with all his princely authority, he commanded her to open her eyes that very instant. The woman's eyelids slowly fluttered open, her gaze still hazy with sleep. Then, a brilliant flash of light erupted, momentarily blinding him. In the next moment, the kitten was back in his bed, rolling around and meowing up at him. He stood completely frozen, utterly stunned by the impossible event he'd just witnessed. The kitten, on the other hand, was just yawning adorably, wondering why on earth he was waking a cat in the dead of night. Seeing his expression, however, she realized the prince was genuinely enraged. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had she kicked him in her sleep? Or maybe touched one of his injuries by accident? The prince paused for a moment, his gaze intense, and then asked the kitten what she truly was. She just looked at him for a second as the girl thought to herself, "He can ask all he wants, but I'm just a cat. I can't do anything more than meow." There was absolutely no way to give him a proper answer. Still in disbelief, he kept trying to form a sentence, but he stopped and restarted several times, his brain clearly unable to process what had just occurred. His confusion only made her feel more bewildered. Then, Syian leaned in close and asked if she was really a cat. She wondered if the man had severe trust issues, and while letting out a meow in response, she mentally questioned if this was quite literally his first time ever seeing a cat. Feeling a little sorry for him, she realized, yes, it really was. The kitten then wondered if he was under the influence of the black magic potion. That substance was supposed to accumulate in his body over time, or perhaps he was just delirious from stress, caught in some kind of waking trance. She remembered reading in the story that an antidote existed, but the only person who knew its secret was Countess Gisela, and unfortunately, she had taken that information with her to the grave. So now, the girl had no idea how to get the prince that antidote. Syian then said that if she revealed her identity right now, he would be lenient with her punishment later on. Hearing that, the girl went into full cat mode, scratching behind her ear and licking her fur as if grooming herself. She figured that would be enough to persuade him. He'd probably just think she was being cute. But instead, Syian just stared at her, his expression dead serious, and asked what in the world she was doing. Feeling that cold rejection, she realized her dignity was in tatters, and she had gained nothing from it. Pattering toward him, she concluded that if her kitten-like charm didn't work, then the potion must be messing with his mind after all. Climbing into his hand, she began licking him, hoping it might somehow help purify the black magic within his system. Syian hesitated for a moment, then sighed and finally gave up. He threw himself back onto the bed, figuring there was no point in interrogating her any further. He wasn't going to get any answers either way. Realizing he had surrendered, the girl hopped onto the bed as well, deciding she might as well go back to sleep. The prince then tucked her in and gave her a few gentle pets. She felt gentle pats and questioned why he was tucking her so snugly into the blanket, but she dismissed the thought. As sleepiness washed over her once more, she drifted into slumber. Just moments later, the same brilliant flash of light erupted again. The prince froze, staring in utter disbelief. What in the world was going on? Before his very eyes, the small kitten was morphing back into a woman. Syian's mind raced, recalling the ancient belief that cats were entities destined to bring ruin to the Hubard Empire if they were ever allowed to thrive. It was this very prophecy that drove the Empire to expend immense resources to eradicate them entirely, a lesson ingrained in him since birth. Yet, the scene unfolding before him defied all logic and imagination, for the creature he thought was a cat was, in fact, a stunningly beautiful woman. A profound conflict stirred within him. A cat clearly existed, yet the Empire remained unharmed, a reality that shattered everything he had ever been taught. Compounding his confusion, imperial records contained no mention of felines transforming into humans. This meant there had to be a fundamental flaw in the ancient prophecy, a deception that had misled the entire nation. Ultimately, the prince clung to one certainty: the Empire would one day be his, and he would stop at nothing to unravel every secret Hubard held. Lost in thought, with the woman still resting beside him, Syian gently stroked her hair. He made a silent vow. Until the day the Empire was his, he would not allow anyone to discover her existence or take her from him. Beyond that vow, a faint blush crept up his neck as he stole glances at her, realizing they urgently needed to find her some proper clothing. The following morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, the kitten awoke. Now that she was truly living as a cat, she found herself needing far more sleep than she used to. Glancing around the room, she wondered where Syian was, and then her eyes caught something unusual. There was a strip of cloth tied to her hind leg, tethering her to the spot. Just as she was puzzling over it, the prince entered carrying a small plate. He informed her that he couldn't have her wandering off at will. A smile played on his lips as he approached with a saucer of milk. Placing it before her, Syian told her to eat up while it was warm and to forget any ideas of escaping. Her spirits sank a little. She couldn't understand how he could sound so pleasant, while delivering such a controlling command. As she sniffed the air, she detected the faint, lingering scent of blood on him. A wave of concern washed over her, and she padded over to him, which seemed to puzzle him. She began to paw and tug at the laces of his shirt, and with a determined nip, she pulled one loose, causing the fabric to fall open and reveal his injuries. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he asked, gently catching her. The sight of the wounds shocked her. They were far worse than she'd imagined. The prince was renowned as the Empire's greatest master of martial arts and swordsmanship. To see such brutal injuries on him made her wonder why he hadn't defended himself. It was bizarre that the Emperor, who was lauded for his might in the original novel, was the very person inflicting this cruelty upon his own son. The girl thought to herself, Syian may be the tragic hero of this story, but that doesn't mean he deserves such a harsh and painful existence. With newfound resolve, she approached him and let out a firm meow, then leaped onto his lap with her paws up, as if scolding him. Amused by her display, the prince asked, "And what is this all about?" He then added, "Are you angry on my behalf? Is that it?" Gazing down at her, Syian couldn't help but smile. He remarked on how strange it was that she behaved so human-like, yet seemed to believe she was a cat. As he spoke, he continued to stroke her fur gently. A question lingered in his mind. Was this all an elaborate act, or was she genuinely unaware of her true nature? He then announced that it was time for them to leave. They had an errand to run, a statement that left the kitten completely bewildered. A short while later, settled inside the carriage, she peered out the window and felt a thrill of excitement she hadn't experienced in ages. To finally see the world beyond the prince's chambers, people strolling in historical attire made it all sink in. She was truly living inside a novel. Her revelry was cut short as the prince gently pulled her back, chiding her for putting her paws on the windowsill. With a soft meow, she reluctantly complied. Soon, the carriage halted, and the coachman announced their arrival. They were met by two individuals who greeted them deferentially, expressing what an honor it was to receive the prince, proudly stating that he had come to the most esteemed clothier in all of Cloud City. All the while, tucked away inside the prince's pocket, curiosity piqued, the kitten couldn't fathom why he'd brought her to a clothing boutique. What could he possibly need from her here? As they entered, a display of masks on the counter immediately caught Syian's eye. He inquired about their purpose, and an attendant explained they were custom accessories for the impending palace masquerade. She mentioned they were still in the final stages of creation, which was why they weren't yet showcased in the main window display. The kitten's mind raced. The prince must be preparing for the ball. And perhaps, just perhaps, he desired a woman's perspective on his choice. Syian then announced he'd prefer to browse alone for a while, politely dismissing the staff. The attendant graciously obliged, and discreetly withdrew. With a soft word from the prince, the kitten emerged from his pocket, instantly taken aback by the sheer opulence of the garments surrounding her. Every single item seemed to cost a fortune. Then, the prince instructed her to choose whatever she fancied. A wave of confusion washed over her before the stunning realization finally dawned. He continued, confessing his ignorance about women's tastes in clothing. All the while, the kitten was spiraling into a quiet panic, realizing they were standing amidst a collection of nightgowns and pajamas. Why in the world would he be buying someone pajamas? Syian explained it was a gift, a revelation that only deepened her confusion as she tried to imagine who this mysterious woman could be. After running through the possibilities, her mind settled on a single, horrifying conclusion. It had to be Countess Gisela, the very woman who had tried to harm him. Could Silly truly intend to gift such lovely attire to the Countess? To be fair, she had to concede that Gisela possessed a breathtaking beauty, the kind that could captivate anyone at a single glance. Furthermore, they were only 3 years apart in age. But that didn't matter. They were supposed to be adversaries. That woman had usurped her mother's position in the palace, so there was no possibility of them being on good terms. She dreaded the thought that he might have fallen for Gisela's charms simply because of the meals she prepared. Utterly horrified, she panicked at the mere possibility. The prince was completely oblivious to the dangerous nature of the woman's cooking. As her thoughts spiraled, Syian's voice cut through, asking if this selection was sufficient, but the kitten erupted into a frenzy of desperate meows, trying again to warn him about the Countess's sinister magical concoctions. Of course, to him, it was all just noise, and he couldn't comprehend her warning. "Don't you want them?" Syian asked, adding that the clothes were a necessity. She shook her head frantically, but the prince simply laughed, a teasing glint in his eyes. "What's this? Are you jealous? Did you think these were for another woman?" Defeated, she could only meow in response. Internally, the prince mused that she was truly unaware of her own secret, the fact that every time she slept, she reverted to her human form. A private smile touched his lips. He decided it would be best to keep this knowledge to himself for the time being. After leaving the shop, they returned to their carriage. Once they were settled, Silly signaled the driver to move on. Inside his pocket, she replayed the entire confusing ordeal in her mind. Seeing Syian smile and hum a little tune to himself only confirmed her suspicion that he was hiding something significant from her. Her suspicion mounting, the kitten resolved not to let her guard down for a second. There was no telling what schemes were brewing in that prince's mind. Just then, his voice broke the silence, asking if she'd like a snack. And just like that, her resolve melted away. Silly placed a small treat on a napkin beside her, watching with amusement as she happily nibbled on it. When she noticed his steady gaze, she let out a questioning meow, wondering if he wanted a taste, or perhaps if she was being greedy. The prince simply patted her head, replying that he wasn't fond of sweets and that she should enjoy the rest. As she basked in his affection, a sudden realization struck her. She had to keep her wits about her. At this rate, she was going to start behaving like a genuine cat, both in her actions and her thoughts. Gazing out the carriage window, she wondered about their destination. It certainly didn't seem like they were returning to the palace. Suddenly, Syian's tone turned serious, and he told her to listen closely. He explained that upon reaching their destination, they would be investigating something important, but he assured her that no matter what transpired, she would be safe. He told her not to be afraid, but his words had the opposite effect. Her tail puffed up instantly. That was precisely the sort of thing one says right before leading you into a dangerous situation. But then, the prince's hand gently stroked her fur, and her anxiety dissolved once more. She mused that perhaps she was growing far too comfortable in his presence. Whether it was the treats or the constant affection, she couldn't be sure. All she knew was that a wave of drowsiness was washing over her as she began to drift off to sleep. A brilliant flash of light illuminated the room, and in its wake, the woman reappeared, nestled in the prince's lap just as before, only this time, a sheet was draped over her. Thankfully, the prince had the foresight to prepare. Silly let out a sigh of relief, grateful he'd brought a blanket as he slid the carriage window shut. His thoughts drifted to the old emperor's era, a time when magic was condemned as a dark art and its practice severely restricted. As a result, sorcerers themselves had faced unrelenting persecution. That was precisely why he had to conceal this strange phenomenon, this creature that was part cat, part woman. The truth was, Silly still had no idea what to even call her. She slept soundly in his lap, and he gently drew the blanket tighter around her small form. He knew they needed to consult with the mages directly. As the carriage rumbled on towards a distant castle, she began to stir. The little kitten blinked, wondering where they were, just as a voice announced, "The Master of Winston has arrived to greet you." Tucked safely back inside the prince's pocket, she figured she wouldn't be able to see their location. But the fact that Silly had hidden her again meant one thing. They had most certainly arrived at their destination. As it happened, they were in the Winston region, within the territory of Duke Delson. A hooded figure walked beside the prince as they passed through a lush garden, vibrant with blooming flowers, adorned with decorations and flying banners. Upon entering the castle, a man with white hair stepped forward to introduce himself to the prince, saying, "I am Valen, Delson." The elderly man greeted Syian formally, addressing him as Your Highness, son of the Hubard Empire, and confessed he never dreamed he would meet him in person. The prince offered a simple nod in response. The assembled men knelt in deference to the future emperor and gestured for him to be seated. It was then a young man named Hubard Empire pulled back his hood. "Forgive my forwardness," he asked, "but may I inquire as to the reason for your majesty's visit?" Syian met his gaze and countered, "Are you certain you wish to know?" Herod's yes was swift and certain. He spoke plainly, explaining that sorcerers in this region were severely marginalized, all because the royal family had branded them as practitioners of dark forces. Therefore, he struggled to understand. He could only speculate why a royal, let alone the crown prince himself, would venture into a place such as this. With unconcealed resentment in his tone, Herod admitted the entire situation was startling. Smiling, the prince remarked that he sounded rather bitter. Valen quickly cut in, ordering his son Herod to hold his tongue and reminding him that he was in the presence of his highness. He then apologized to the prince, explaining his son's immaturity and disrespectful behavior, and pleaded for mercy. "It matters not," Syian replied dismissively. "It's only natural the boy would harbor resentment towards the palace. But my reason for this unannounced visit is quite simple. There is something I must confirm." Reaching into his coat pocket, Silly produced the small kitten, placing her gently upon the table. A profound silence fell over the room as everyone stared, completely stunned to see a cat before them. Stunned whispers filled the air. "Is that truly a cat? Why bring such a grotesque thing here?" Syian stated that he was unconcerned if magic was currently branded a dark force by the palace. He intended to use every resource at his command. With a grave expression, he informed the sorcerers he required them to unravel the curse connected to this cat. That single command sent a jolt through the protagonist. So, his name is Hubard Empire, she thought, a faint flicker of recognition in her mind. She recalled from the original story that this brilliant young sorcerer was destined to lead a rebellion against the prince once he became emperor, during the novel's final arc. The fact that they were encountering him now, before Syian's coronation, meant that the story was already deviating significantly from its original course. Everyone remained seated around the table, the prince at its head, all eyes fixed on the white kitten. Meanwhile, the girl realized that from this point forward, she probably couldn't predict the future with any accuracy. Suddenly, Herod's composure shattered. "Why on earth would you bring a cursed creature?" he screamed. "To this sacred place?" Drawing his blade, Herod roared that if the palace sought to keep its own hands clean by bringing the cat here for the sorcerers to deal with, then he would end its life himself. Without a moment's hesitation, panic seized the kitten, but just as Herod's blade descended, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. "Syian, was already on his feet, his own sword drawn, with the kitten held safely in his other arm. "Who," he asked, his voice like ice, "gave you permission to draw your dagger?" Herod's weapon now lay shattered on the floor, broken into pieces. His father cried out in shock, but Silly turned to the old man and said coldly, "You should be more worried about the cat than your son." Herod shot back, declaring that the prince was now surrounded by sorcerers, and if he imagined he could draw a sword without consequences, he was gravely mistaken. But he was sharply cut off by his own father, who commanded him to hold his tongue in the presence of his highness. Bowing his forehead, the man pleaded for forgiveness once more, explaining his son was too immature to comprehend the gravity of the situation, and implored the prince to lower his sword. Syian complied, but then added with a cold edge, "This cat is mine, and anyone who comes near what belongs to me will be punished." However, he declared he would let it pass this time. Shaken, Valane asked, "Do you truly claim this cat as your own?" He pointed out that according to prophecy, felines were destined to bring about the downfall of the Empire. Therefore, hearing such a thing from the heir to the throne was profoundly unsettling. Meanwhile, the kitten sat silently on the table, its head bowed. Syian said he disdained beating around the bush and would get straight to the matter. As he spoke, magical runes began to form around him, and fire started to flicker in the air. He then asked, "Shall I proceed at the same speed my fire spreads?" Flames and searing heat began to engulf the room. The sorcerers were clearly unnerved. The prince was unleashing his aura. The fire crackled and coiled around him, a sight that left even the kitten stunned. This was Syian's aura, the prince's hidden power. Aura was a form of energy that only those who had attained an elite level of swordsmanship could command. Yet, in this world, aura was considered a rare and phenomenal force, one that was more akin to magic than anything else. This was why aura was avoided and rarely witnessed outside of a battlefield. It was considered an incredibly dangerous power. And to compound the issue, he was in a place filled with sorcerers, a group historically viewed as enemies of the royal family. The prince using his aura so openly could expose a monumental secret and place him in extreme danger. Even so, Syian was not holding back. He was brazenly flaunting his aura, which prompted the protagonist to wonder, why is he taking things this far? The prince then demanded, "Now that you've witnessed this, will you investigate the curse or not?" Valane bowed, agreeing to obey the prince's command and pleading with him to withdraw his aura. As the man approached the kitten, the girl's mind raced, wondering what was happening. This entire situation had diverged so wildly from the original story. Feeling a deep sense of unease, she questioned how she could possibly survive in this world if she could no longer rely on her foreknowledge of the plot. As he began to inspect her with magic, he suddenly froze, shocked by the sheer energy he was sensing. Stunned, he stammered that he couldn't believe it. Syian asked coolly if he was finished. The man nodded, explaining that the power was so immense, no one could possibly undo it. It wasn't a curse at all. This cat was under a divine blessing. The very god of this world was protecting her. This revelation piqued the protagonist's curiosity. Valane went on, explaining that while everyone believed the prophecy foretold that cats were malevolent beings doomed to perish, this one was enveloped by divine protection. And, as unbelievable as it sounded, he believed from his humble analysis that this cat and all her ancestors had been divinely protected for many generations. Syian rested his chin in his hand, thinking, so, this cat's arrival that day was no mere coincidence. Valane explained that he felt a powerful connection to an ancient, protective force. He believed the cat's parents likely possessed that same blessing, which could mean they were still alive. That would explain how she had survived for so long, and how she could even exist when cats were thought to be extinct. The protagonist leaned forward slightly, now intensely curious about this cat's parents in this world. Then Valane turned to his son and beckoned him to come closer, instructing him to scan the cat's memories. Herod scoffed, saying he hadn't mastered such a complex spell just to use it on a simple animal. This earned him a sharp scolding from his father, who reminded him that he had taught him that all living beings are equal. Grumbling, Herod conceded and apologized to the prince for his behavior. Then he hesitated, asking if he might dare to touch the paw of a creature belonging to his highness. Syian looked him directly in the eyes and said, "I will allow it, but only the paw." As Herod reached forward, a brilliant flash of light erupted. Closing his eyes, he focused. But then his brow furrowed, and he asked aloud, "What in the world is this?" He was witnessing the grand palace garden, the majestic castle, familiar landscapes, and behind it all was Syian, present from the very beginning of the kitten's memories. As Herod's eyes fluttered open, he murmured, "That was peculiar. There was nothing but the castle and the prince." Syian pressed him. "What do you mean? Nothing but?" Herod clarified. "It's exactly as it sounds. The only human in the cat's recollections was you, Your Highness. Every single one of her memories is connected to you." "And what does that imply?" Syian inquired. The sorcerer explained that it appeared the kitten had somehow lost all of her prior memories, a revelation that deeply intrigued the prince. Why was he the only one she could recall? He then inquired if they'd discovered anything more about the divine blessing, but the sorcerers conceded that it was impossible to probe any deeper using magical means. A divine power residing within the cat actively blocked any form of deep magical inquiry, meaning they would need to employ less traditional methods to continue their research. Syian nodded, agreeing to investigate curses that extended beyond the established prophecy, explaining his belief that the original prophetic text was destroyed long ago. Despite this, the prince insisted that if they pooled their efforts, they were bound to discover something. With that, they all settled in around the table. After a moment's hesitation, Herod spoke up. "I think I'm beginning to understand. Your Highness, the real reason you're here, it isn't just about the curse, is it?" Syian let out a weary sigh and nodded. He revealed that as the crown prince, he was there to make them an official proposal. He then placed a letter bearing the imperial seal upon the table, which, upon being opened, was revealed to be a contract. Syian instructed them to examine it carefully. The sorcerers were stunned, recognizing the document for what it was, stamped with the sun emblem of the empire. Their first question was simply, why? Why had he chosen them? Syian's response was direct. "The Delsin family is the only line of mages that has never submitted to the crown. Not even after all these centuries," he continued. "And I," he stated, "need people who do not so easily bow their heads to authority. That is why I must make you an offer that holds a true benefit for you." They asked what kind of offer he had in mind. As they watched him with rapt attention, the prince announced his plan to reopen the academy. The mere mention of it was enough to stun both mages, catching them completely off guard. Syian explained that the former emperor had personally shut down the academy, in order to eradicate any potential rivals from the mage faction. He continued that, regardless of the past, re-establishing it now was the perfect way to form an alliance. The elder mage warned that such a move would put the prince in immense danger, but Syian retorted that he would handle all the repercussions himself. All he required of them, he said, was to concentrate on training new mages. He then added that, as they all surely knew, the empire was currently holding on by a thread. It was apparent that dark secrets festered within the empire, secrets that seemed to revolve around the mysterious cat. Syian knew that fixing the nation's deep-seated problems would not be easy, but his mind was set. He declared that if they put their trust in him, he would personally see to it that the former glory of the mages was restored. Valen then gravely pointed out that for a mage, this contract signified the absolute surrender of their life and power to a master. A mage, he explained, could only unleash their most potent magic after forming such a bond, but this came at the cost of their own identity, making them utterly dependent on their master. Syian answered frankly, stating he wouldn't pretend this was about some grand ambition like building an empire. He simply wanted to find the truth. What they had discovered so far completely contradicted the prophecy, and that fact alone made him intensely curious about the secrets lying at the heart of the matter. The elder sorcerer admitted the proposal was not something to be taken lightly. Yet, after exchanging a look with his son, they both gave a firm nod. Valen then declared, loud and clear, that he, Valen Delsin, would dedicate his life to serving His Highness's commands. The instant the words left his lips, chains of magical energy shot forth from the contract, sealing their pact. From that day forward, Syian was officially their master. After 500 years, the Delsin family was welcoming a new master. The prince smiled, remarking on how Valen had just called him master, then turned to Herod. He announced he had a first task for him. The young mage eagerly agreed, filled with anticipation. But what Syian pulled from his bag next caught everyone completely by surprise. He produced a pair of pajamas from his satchel, leaving the two mages completely and utterly confused. Herod asked what on earth they were for, and the prince explained. He wanted him to enchant the garments, so they would automatically adjust to the size of whoever put them on. Herod could only mutter in disbelief at the bizarre request, fathom why anyone would ever require such a peculiar enchantment. However, one look at Syian's stern expression was enough to silence his questions, and he nervously agreed to the request. The mage then positioned himself inside a glowing magic circle etched onto the floor and began the incantation. After a few moments, he declared that the spell was complete. The enchantment ensured the garments would perfectly conform to any wearer, no matter their size or shape. The prince praised the mage's skill, stated that his services were no longer needed for the day, and announced that it was time for him to depart. Later, back in Syian's chambers at the imperial palace, he beckoned the cat closer, holding up the pajamas and gesturing for her to wear them. She just stared at him, utterly bewildered. Thoroughly perplexed, she wondered to herself why in the world a cat would ever need human pajamas. The entire idea was completely nonsensical. Resolutely shaking her head, she decided there was absolutely no way she was putting those on. They looked ridiculously uncomfortable, and she adored curling up in the soft, fresh linens with nothing on. The thought that the prince actually expected her to sacrifice that simple pleasure was unbelievable. Being trapped in this world within a feline form was already disheartening enough. She refused to surrender one of the few genuine perks of being a cat, the glorious freedom of sleeping in her own fur without a shred of judgment. Internally, she was staging a passionate protest for feline rights and the fundamental freedom to sleep however she pleased. But from the outside, all Syian saw was his little cat meowing repeatedly. He tilted his head, asking if she truly disliked the pajamas that much, to which she responded with an emphatic, annoyed meow. He then inquired if she would consider wearing them at all, and her answer was just as firm, a very clear no. A smirk played on his lips as he warned her not to regret this decision later, a cryptic comment that left her confused, but she quickly dismissed his words. Later that night, Syian gently draped a blanket over the sleeping, silver-haired girl, a knowing smile on his face as he whispered, "I did warn you to put something on." The following day, as spring began to breathe life into the castle grounds, Syian officially turned 19. By this point, according to the original novel's timeline, he should have already consumed a perilous quantity of Countess Gisella's dark magic potion. As per the story's progression, it was around this time that the effects should have manifested as severe exhaustion, debilitating pain, and the emergence of a deeply sinister aura. Yet, to the protagonist's bewilderment, she couldn't help but wonder why he appeared so vibrant and healthy. Syian, for his part, sat calmly sipping his tea. She began to speculate if perhaps he possessed some sort of secret regenerative power she was unaware of, because he looked positively radiant. Setting a small saucer of milk on the table for her, Syian instructed her to drink up, and she meowed in agreement. Suddenly, a sharp tapping sound against the window pane captured her attention. Her head snapped up to see a large bird perched outside. It was a majestic white eagle with a small parcel tied to its leg. Syian acted completely unfazed, remarking casually that a delivery had arrived. The protagonist watched with uncertainty, wondering if Syian was somehow acquainted with the eagle. She mused on whether such occurrences were simply normal in a fantasy world. Upon opening the window, the bird gracefully flew inside, allowing Syian to untie the object from its leg. It was a letter, which he unrolled and began to read immediately. The prince let out a soft sigh, murmuring that while it wasn't his lucky day, at least he'd received a message explaining why she couldn't see him. He reasoned that receiving a cancellation was far better than being left waiting without any word at all. Turning to the eagle, Syian noted that it must be tired and offered it some water. She silently wondered if all eagles were this remarkably obedient. The bird then turned its piercing gaze directly on her, causing her to freeze in place, slightly unnerved. A moment later, the eagle launched itself back into the sky. Syian explained that the bird's name was Mikio, a gift from his mother who had tamed it herself. He then added that a reply needed to be sent by day's end. Now paying close attention, she surmised that this eagle must be the most dependable method of correspondence in the region. Gently stroking the top of her head, the prince informed her he was going to visit His Majesty, the Emperor, and that she would be perfectly safe as long as she remained in the room, a condition to which she readily agreed. As he made his way toward the Emperor's chambers, Syian's mind replayed the contents of the letter. In it, the sender had referred to him as their dear son and apologized for canceling their meeting on such short notice. The writer explained a necessary trip to the Tinessa region for rehabilitation, but insisted the matter was not serious. The letter addressed him as the son of Rupert, urging him not to worry about his mother and to concentrate entirely on his own well-being, his responsibilities and duties as the heir to the throne. The letter concluded with a heartfelt prayer for her son, signed simply, Elise Syian's mother. Just then, outside, the sharp crack of a weapon sent birds scattering into the sky. Nearby, a magnificent lion lay bleeding on the ground, surrounded by several guards. One remarked that the creature hadn't even flinched when they'd whipped it, only collapsing after the gunshot. Another voice chimed in, calling it an impressive tribute from the continent of Labar. The speaker was none other than Adolf Reinhardt, the emperor of the Hubard Empire himself. He casually noted how amusing it was to play with one's prey. Taking a seat next to Syian, he raised a teacup to his lips. The prince, however, stated he'd lost his appetite and had seen enough for one day. He ordered the animal to be taken to the plains for its final rest. The guards complied, beginning to haul away the crate holding the lion's lifeless body. Just then, another man approached and bowed, introducing himself as Chief of Staff, Lennon Macmillan. He apologized for intruding on their leisure, but stressed that he carried an urgent message for His Majesty and humbly requested a private word. The emperor granted his request, and the man leaned close to whisper in his ear. A moment later, the emperor spun around, his face contorted with rage, and spat that the sorcerers he so despised were suddenly appearing everywhere, demanding to know why. In stark contrast, Syian calmly took a sip of his tea. So, he thought, the palace had finally caught wind of the mage's movements. His gaze fell on Lennon Macmillan, a treacherous and vile man whom he knew was secretly in the pocket of Countess Gisela, despite his title as Chief of Staff. For a fleeting moment, Syian wondered if he had pushed things too far. But then, with a faint smile, the prince casually announced that he was the one who had summoned the mages. The words hit Lennon like a physical blow, leaving him frozen in disbelief. It was clearly the last answer he'd expected. The Chief of Staff sputtered, demanding to know what madness had possessed the prince to summon mages. Syian, unperturbed, calmly replied that he felt it was necessary to keep them close, under observation. Observation? Lennon questioned, his voice laced with suspicion. Precisely that, Syian confirmed, before explaining his reasoning. He pointed out that unlike the nobility, the common citizens often turned to mages for help with illnesses and other troubles. It was because of this existing trust that he intended to use the mages these figures already held in high regard by the people to bolster the palace's image and foster loyalty among the common folk. And, he added, he was doing all of this for his father, the emperor. A convenient lie, of course. To his surprise, the emperor roared with laughter, declaring the boy was right. Adolf found the sentiment that Syian was showing remarkable initiative in supporting his father to be truly admirable, and his laughter boomed even louder. Then, his eyes fell upon the Chief of Staff. "Don't you agree?" he asked. Visibly terrified, Lennon stammered his agreement, adding that the bond between His Majesty and the prince was profound and true. As the emperor's laughter continued to echo, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. A woman's voice cut through the air, remarking on the crowd. It was none other than Countess Gisela. With a dismissive wave, she ordered the Chief of Staff to leave, stating she'd come for a quiet cup of tea, only to find it far too noisy with so many people about. The man scurried away obediently. Syian watched him go, thinking him nothing more than a pathetic wretch. The emperor turned to the countess, inquiring about her visit, as he assumed she'd be preoccupied with organizing the masquerade ball. The woman explained that she had heard a rare black lion was on display at the greenhouse, and had come for a look. Glancing around, she asked where the creature was. The prince coolly replied that it had been sent to the plains, and she was welcome to view it there. Changing the subject, the emperor asked how preparations for the masquerade were proceeding. The countess assured him she was doing her utmost, adding that if only Her Majesty the Empress were still present, she could have managed it all herself. The remark was a clear jab, and the prince visibly bristled. The emperor, however, just chuckled, callously remarking, what use was a woman more dedicated to her recovery than her royal duties? He then added that Catherine would be more than capable on her own. The countess laughed, remarking that he was as cruel as ever. Then she turned her gaze to the prince, pointedly asking for his opinion on the matter. Syian simply replied that, regardless, he had full confidence the Countess would do a superb job. But inwardly, he seethed, reflecting on how utterly insufferable everyone at court was. A dark thought crossed his mind, perhaps he should just eliminate them all. He dismissed the thought. It was far too soon. A quick demise would be a mercy they didn't deserve. He preferred a slower approach, one where he would methodically crush their spirits until they pleaded for the release of death. Back within the prince's chambers, the protagonist's attention was caught by the sound of the door creaking open. She paused, wondering if Syian had returned so soon. Then, a ragged coughing sound broke the silence, prompting her to investigate. She found Syian looking terribly unwell, and a wave of concern washed over her, making her question what could have happened. Had something occurred at the tea gathering? Or had Countess Gisela tampered with the food once more? She knew the side effects of black magic potions all too well, excruciating pain and sickness. It would have been simple to lace his meal. A chilling memory surfaced in the original narrative. Syian's dependency on those dark concoctions began to manifest. It started right around his 19th birthday, and a jolt of fear ran through her as she realized he was precisely that age now. Her anxious thoughts were interrupted as she watched the prince begin to remove his formal attire. This was it, she thought grimly. This was the moment in the story when the agony would become unbearable, the very torment that would eventually compel him to strike down his own father and seize the throne for himself. He moved through the room in a silent haze, his expression vacant as if she weren't there, before finally collapsing onto a nearby couch. A profound sadness settled over her. It was so unfair. He was still just a young man, forced to endure this immense suffering with no one to see it. It wasn't that he was adept at concealing his agony. Rather, no one in this cold palace was close enough to him to even care. He had no one watching his back. Yet, all this time, Syian had been the one protecting her. He had been shielding her during her most vulnerable moments. But he was only human, and this burden was too heavy to carry alone. Resolved, she decided she had to do something to help, starting by grabbing the small dress. Using a pillow as a makeshift step, she clambered up and gently placed the fabric Syian had bought for her on his feverish head. Her first priority was to bring his temperature down. She repurposed a nearby dish of milk, soaking pieces of cloth to use as compresses. By the time she was finished, the area was a mess and she was utterly spent, but she had managed to provide some relief. His temperature was finally starting to drop. She longed to curl up in the comfort of the large bed again, but then she noticed she had inadvertently toppled the stack of pillows. With the bed now out of reach and few alternatives available, she wriggled into the enchanted clothing that Syian had arranged for her, the one crafted for her by the mages. A drowsy chuckle escaped her. Here she was, a cat wearing a tiny dress. The sight would surely make anyone burst into laughter. Her thoughts drifted back to Syian, and she wondered if this small act of care could ever repay him for sparing her. Suddenly, a brilliant flash of light illuminated the entire room. As dawn broke the next morning, Syian stirred, becoming aware of something resting on his forehead. He reached up and found a miniature dress, damp with what felt like water and perspiration. Pushing himself to a sitting position, a thought crossed his mind. Could it be possible? Had the little kitten truly been nursing him through his feverish state? His gaze shifted to the side, where he saw a silver-haired girl in pajamas, fast asleep on the cold floor. A soft smile touched his lips as he realized she must have tended to him until she finally succumbed to exhaustion. Kneeling beside her sleeping form, he whispered softly, "It seems you're the only one on my side in this miserable place." Just then, the girl murmured something in her sleep. Gently scooping her into his arms, Syian chided softly, knowing she would catch a chill from sleeping on the hard floor. "And then I would be forced to look after you," he added. He carried her to the bed, laying her down carefully before settling in beside her. Brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, he spoke in a low voice. "Should I reward you for being so good?" he mused. And then a name came to him. Reinhardt. It meant Little Queen, fitting for how, within the confines of this room, she carried herself like royalty. She even bossed him around, so he felt it was a perfect fit. As the protagonist slowly stirred from her slumber, the prince gave her nose a playful little pinch. Drowsily, she became aware of her surroundings, wondering how she'd gotten into the bed and for how long she'd been out. Beside her, the prince's voice broke the silence. "Did you sleep well, Reinhardt?" Slightly confused, she could only manage a small meow in response. The young prince smiled. "That will be your name from this day forward." A thrill of excitement went through her. In this strange new world, she had been nameless until now. and the name Syian had bestowed upon her was Reinhardt. She suddenly sat bolt upright, meowing with a desperate urgency. She was trying to ask if he was all right. Incredibly, he seemed to understand her unspoken question, replying, "I'm fine, thanks to a certain little cat who looked after me. So, as a token of my gratitude, I gave you a name." The protagonist placed a paw on her own forehead in a gesture of relief, feeling a deep sense of happiness at his words. The prince explained that to express his true gratitude, he felt compelled to share a secret with her, which left her utterly bewildered. He began by saying that, in truth, she had been transforming into a human during her sleep. The protagonist was struck completely speechless by this revelation. He then continued, explaining that in that form, she was also entirely unclothed. A heavy silence descended as she stared at him, the word echoing in her mind. Overwhelmed with panic, she began to tremble uncontrollably, letting out a series of frantic meows. And then, the tension finally snapped. The sharp sound of shattering glass resounded through the room, followed by a loud, piercing cry. Still in the room, Syian called out to her, but she simply turned her back, her tail twitching with fury. The prince asked if she intended to ignore him from now on, and her mind screamed, "Obviously!" The thought that he had seen her completely bare was deeply mortifying, and it upset her immensely. Based on his description, she found the entire situation profoundly embarrassing. He sighed and extended a hand toward her, saying he wanted to explain why he hadn't revealed this sooner, but his only reward was a sharp scratch across his hand. He was taken completely by surprise. The protagonist knew at once she had made a mistake. It was a pure reflex. She never intended to hurt him. He grabbed his coat, suggesting she should rest and compose herself as he was leaving for his duties. A wave of anxiety washed over the cat, wondering if Syian was upset by the scratch. Gazing at his hand, Syian mused that even with his inherent resilience, her claws had only managed to leave a faint mark upon his skin. He slid a ring onto his finger, completing his preparations. The prince announced he was leaving and instructed her to behave and remain quiet. As she flicked her tail against the carpet, the protagonist felt a growing restlessness, wondering when he would be back. She felt the blame for what happened was hers alone, and she truly wanted to apologize the moment he returned. Suddenly, she detected hushed whispers coming from the doorway. Then, a voice insisted they must find anything that could cause a problem. She froze for a moment just as the door swung open. A jolt of terror ran through her as she realized someone was boldly entering the prince's chambers at this hour without even knocking. Several maids entered, and a woman remarked that they had very little time. Judging by the prince's disposition, his meeting with the Lavern embassy would not be a lengthy one. That woman was none other than Countess Catherine Harmon Gazella. The protagonist thought, "I knew the emperor favored her, but even so, surely she has no right to barge into the prince's room and search his belongings whenever she pleases." Reacting on instinct, the cat scrambled for cover under the prince's bed. The countess declared she'd heard he visited a boutique, meaning there must be some trace of a woman here, and they were to find it. The protagonist was confused at first, but then she recalled the clothing store where they had bought the pajamas. The women trailing the countess seemed quite apprehensive. One of them stepped forward, apologizing as she asked the countess why His Majesty's involvement with a woman was any of her concern. She worried that it might have severe consequences if they spoke so freely on the matter. The countess turned to her, addressing her as Lady Anos, and asked who had given her leave to even think. The woman stood there, frozen in shock like a statue. The countess, however, continued, stating that her only purpose was to follow orders as she pressed a fan to the lady's chin. She warned her not to waste her time or to dare defy her commands. The woman apologized once more, and the countess then questioned if she honestly believed the prince was courting a noblewoman. The countess was certain that whoever the crown prince was seeing did not come from a wealthy family. After all, if she were an aristocrat, her presence would have been noted at the palace by now. But meeting her at a clothing shop meant her social standing prevented them from being seen together in public. Therefore, Catherine ordered that anything even remotely suspicious was to be brought directly to her. The women complied, while the protagonist thought she would be in a terrible predicament if they found her. They searched for some time, but in the end, the maids reported that they had discovered nothing unusual. This report sent the countess into a fury. She called them useless and cursed them for failing to inspect the room with proper care. While Gazella was ranting that they might as well be blind for all the good their eyes were, A sound from the doorway caught their attention. A young maid entered the room and apologized, explaining that she assumed no one was present, as the prince was in a meeting with the ambassador. The countess cast a smug look at her and demanded to know who she was, perhaps the prince's aide, or an agent he had sent to secretly monitor the countess. The maid stammered, insisting that wasn't the case at all. She had merely come to tidy His Highness's chambers. Seizing the chance to intimidate her, Gisela questioned if she truly thought it was acceptable to waltz into the prince's room without permission, even if it was just to clean. On the verge of tears, the maid explained the prince himself had permitted her to clean whenever she found the door open. But the countess remained unconvinced, threatening to rip the maid's tongue out to get to the truth. Meanwhile, the poor girl could only tremble, her head bowed in fear. Lady Anna Rose leaned in close, whispering to the countess that their time was up and the prince would return soon. The countess agreed they should depart, but on her way, out the door, she shot a final warning to the maid, vowing that she would remember her face. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, leaving the protagonist to wonder if they were finally gone. But the white-haired maid was still present. She approached the bed with slow, deliberate steps. As she crouched down, a wave of panic washed over the protagonist, terrified of being discovered and mystified as to where this woman had come from. Then, with chilling purpose, the maid peered directly under the bed, as if she knew something was hidden there. Reinhardt trembled, her heart pounding with the fear of being seen. As the maid's hand reached under the bed, blindly searching, Reinhardt forced herself to remain utterly still and silent, petrified of being found. She wondered if the woman somehow knew a cat was hiding there, but that seemed impossible. They hadn't even made eye contact. A suspicion began to dawn on Reinhardt. This girl wasn't here for cleaning. She realized the maid's searching hand was now inches from her fur, and the woman's breathing was growing labored from the effort. Just as their fingers were about to brush, the prince strode into the room. Taking in the scene at a glance, he demanded to know what the maid was doing. Both were startled by his sudden arrival and turned to face him. Visibly annoyed, Syian remarked that he was certain he had closed the door when he left. Lowering her head, the maid replied that the door was already ajar when she entered. The prince cut her off, saying that was quite enough, and ordered her to leave immediately. The maid offered a hasty apology to His Highness and quickly exited. After securing the door, Syian immediately turned and called out for Reinhardt, and the cat crawled out from beneath the bed. With a mournful look, she meowed softly at the prince. Syian gently scooped her up, asking if she was all right or if she had been hurt. Fuming, he pointed out that he had specifically double-checked the lock before leaving, which meant he was certain Countess Gisela was the one who had opened it. Startled, the cat wondered how he could possibly know that. The prince sighed, explaining that he had run into her on his way back, noting she looked paler than a ghost. Reinhardt's gaze then fell on his hand, which was still marked by her earlier scratch. She began to lick the spot gently. Even after she had harmed him, Syian was still protecting her. Suddenly, the prince's ring began to emit a soft, pulsing glow. Seeing this, he noted that someone was trying to contact him. Looking deep into Reinhardt's eyes, he asked if she was ready to learn more about herself. With her eyes wide with possibility, the protagonist contemplated his offer, while the prince held a patient smile, awaiting her answer. Outside, the young maid was glancing around nervously. Something felt terribly wrong. She questioned if this garden had always been a part of the palace, and why it was so unnervingly silent. The entire place felt strange, almost like a dream world. From behind her, a man's voice called out. It was Valendusen, asking how she had managed to get in here. The maid spun around, startled. He went on to explain that he had created this space using powerful magic, and only he and his master were meant to have access. Valendusen then declared it was obvious the girl had been searching for something. The maid quickly tried to deny it, claiming it wasn't true, and that she had simply lost her way and ended up here. The Duke wasn't buying her story for a second, and asked her bluntly if she was looking for a cat. Her face froze over instantly. The girl began to stammer out a defense, insisting she had no clue what the man was talking about. But the fact that she had begun to tremble gave away her lie. Valendusen warned her that telling the truth would be in her best interest, as his master had no patience for being led on a wild goose chase. Behind her, with his arms crossed, Syian was glaring at her intensely. She hesitated for a heartbeat before bowing her head to greet the prince. Syian recognized her immediately. It was the very same maid who had been rummaging through his room earlier. The prince demanded her name. She replied that she was called Arena, and he guessed she hadn't discovered what she was searching for in his chambers. And the maid insisted her only purpose there was to clean. Syian took a deep breath and he cut her off sharply, declaring she was wasting their time with another blatant lie. Leaning closer to her face, he whispered with cold fury, demanding an immediate answer. "Who do you work for?" Pinned by a stare that could petrify a Gorgon, the maid broke into a cold sweat. She continued to swear she was not a spy, insisting she had nothing to tell them. The prince informed her that she had clearly misunderstood the situation. This was not a polite inquiry. It was a command. The woman shrieked that she didn't work for anyone. Reinhardt, from her vantage point, frantically wondered what to do. Syian's rage was visibly escalating as the woman begged them to believe her, but her pleas were completely ignored. The protagonist knew with chilling certainty that she had to intervene, or the prince would kill this maid. Seeing no point in prolonging the ordeal, the prince's hand moved to the hilt of his sword. Realizing his intent, Reinhardt knew she couldn't allow him to become a heartless tyrant. In that precise moment, she leaped from his pocket and clung clumsily to the sword. Startled, Syian froze in place. Even Valen was rendered speechless. Gripping the scabbard, the cat felt a surge of pride, knowing she had stopped him. When he demanded to know why, the only thought in her head was that he was about to take a life. Duke Philaine Deucin, watching from the side, could hardly believe his eyes. His Highness had actually brought a cat along. He questioned the risk, asking what might have happened had she been discovered. The prince simply stated that he believed the primary party of interest ought to be present. Ina froze, her eyes wide with disbelief at the sight before her. The cat looked back, hesitating, as the woman didn't seem like someone who was afraid of felines. Even if it was her first time seeing this particular creature, the girl suddenly rushed towards the cat, attempting to snatch her away from the prince's grasp. Philaine barely had time to shout a warning. Seeing the maid's hands lunging for her, Reinhardt's first instinct was that she was being kidnapped. But then, with tears streaming down her face, Ina cried out, "You're alive," her voice breaking as she called the cat, "My baby." In the past, the maid had left the cat in the garden, instructing her to hide if anyone passed by and to run if someone tried to catch her. She had asked her to be a good girl and behave until she returned from her duties. That evening, after her shift ended, the girl came back, but the cat was gone from the garden. Panic seized her, since the little one always ran directly to her when called. She was consumed by a terrible fear and worry. She searched high and low, but her baby had vanished. Hearing this account, the prince finally pieced together what had occurred on the day he found Reinhardt and took her in. It now made perfect sense why she had been in that garden. Tears were still rolling down Ina's cheeks. She had been certain she had lost her baby forever, but she could never have fathomed that Reinhardt had lost her memories and had been with Syian this entire time. The maid embraced the cat, squeezing her so tightly it was almost difficult to breathe. She fretted that her baby must have been terrified by the amnesia. Ina was overcome with relief, realizing their lives had been spared. She didn't even know how to begin to thank His Highness. Syian said that, since the girl was Reinhardt's mother, that, by his logic, made her a cat as well, which meant she could thank him by answering some of his questions. The maid agreed without a second thought. Meanwhile, Valen appeared utterly confused by this line of reasoning, still trying to reconcile the connection between the girl and the cat. The prince asked if there were any others, besides the two of them, but Ina confirmed that was not the case. After the prophecy was made public, their kind began to be hunted down. Even mages were dispatched to pursue them. In that terrible time, all the other catfolk had been slain. Syian sought clarification. "Are you referring to the prophecy that states cats will bring about the end of the world?" Ina explained that it began after a fabricated case claimed cats were murdering children as demonic sacrifices, which led to them being branded as creatures of darkness. Hearing this, Reinhardt wished with all her might that it was just a horrible story, and yet, she felt a profound sadness and an inexplicable guilt. She didn't know why, but some part of it felt achingly familiar. This sorrow, this burden of guilt. She couldn't identify whose feelings they were, but she felt them swelling painfully in her chest. Turning his attention back to Reinhardt, Syian gently asked if she was all right or if something was the matter. The maid then inquired if the prince himself had given the cat the name Reinhardt. He quickly affirmed that he had, but now that he knew the cat had a mother, his curiosity was piqued. What was her true name? Ina admitted, however, that she had never given her one. When he asked why, she explained, holding her daughter close, that it was because they had been living under a curse. Syian was visibly shocked and urged her to tell him everything. Furthermore, Irena explained that the curse's primary effect was their transformation into cats, and under the light of a red moon, they were fated to conceive and bear a child. This, she revealed, was the cruel punishment they were forced to endure. When pressed for more on the punishment, Irena confessed that she didn't know the full extent of it. Veen interjected, clarifying that the red moon was a rare event, appearing only once every 70 years. The most recent occurrence was 18 years prior, in the year 511 of the imperial calendar. Irena confirmed this, adding that a mere 10 months later, she gave birth to her child, and that she was now 89 years old. The revelation left the protagonist utterly speechless. How could someone of that age possess such a youthful appearance? But as the initial shock subsided, a chilling realization dawned on her. She, too, would cease to age, and one day, she would also fall pregnant beneath a red moon. Irena went on to explain that her child would reach full maturity within a single year, which tragically meant she had only that much time remaining in this world. Their people were born as human children and developed normally, but upon reaching the age of 20, their aging process would halt, leaving them frozen in time for the remainder of their lives, until the very moment they turned 90. Syian now grasped the nature of their life cycle, yet he couldn't understand why this meant Reinhardt had yet to receive a name. Irena revealed that something unforeseen had occurred. When Syian pressed for an explanation, the maid elaborated. Under normal circumstances, they appear human during their waking hours, only transforming into cats as they sleep. But this child bears a different version of the curse. Reinhardt was completely taken aback. She had no idea why she was an exception to the rule. Startled, Syian finally pieced it all together. Her curse was inverted. And because of this anomaly, Irena had intended to name her only after finding a solution, but her search yielded no answers, and she couldn't bring herself to formally name her daughter. Syian remarked that nothing like this had ever been recorded, and the maid sorrowfully agreed. He then inquired if she had any leads or theories. Irena admitted she hadn't found anything conclusive, but she held a strong belief that there was one location that might hold the information they desperately needed. The prince asked where, and as she tried to speak, it was clear that Irena was incredibly nervous. After all, she had just divulged a deeply personal secret about herself and her daughter to the Prince of the Empire. Reinhardt gently placed a paw on her hand, a gesture of trust and unwavering support. Clutching her daughter's tiny paw, Irena faced His Highness and made her request to be taken to the Imperial Archives. For a brief moment, Syian was perplexed by her plea. Irena quickly clarified that while she knew entry was strictly forbidden, it was the most probable place to find even the slightest clue. A heavy silence hung between them for a few seconds. Then, turning to Veen, Syian asked if he could teleport them there, a question that startled Irena. Veen confirmed that it was indeed possible, but he voiced his concern that they would surely be discovered. Syian assured him, promising to handle that aspect personally. A faint smile touched Irena's lips as she felt a profound sense of gratitude toward His Highness, but the prince insisted there was no need for thanks. He explained he was doing this to uncover the truth for his own reasons. Nevertheless, he asked the maid what she planned to do next. She seemed confused by the question. Syian then clarified by mentioning Reinhardt. Now that the cat was reunited with her mother, did this signify that it was time for her to bid farewell to the prince? Irena responded that she had one more request for His Highness. She wished for the cat to remain with Syian until they reached the Imperial Archives. The prince questioned her reasoning. She explained that as a mere servant, it would be exceedingly difficult for her to conceal her child, referring to her as Reinhardt by name. The woman was certain her daughter would be far safer in the prince's care, just as she had been until now. Extending his hand, Syian tenderly scooped up the small cat, vowing to look after her for the night. He then laid out the plan. They would venture to the Imperial Archives the very next morning, and asked Veen if the task would prove difficult. The mage assured him it was quite simple. Bowing deeply, Irena expressed that she had no way to possibly repay the immense help she was receiving from the prince. A confused Syian asked why she was crying. Meanwhile, Reinhardt wondered to herself if he was truly all right with the idea of letting her go so easily. Later that night, after meticulously surveying every corner of Syian's chamber, the little cat thought, "This could be the very last time I ever see this room. Or him." The soft click of a door opening made her turn. As he emerged from the washroom, the young man saw that the cat was still awake and asked if she had been waiting up for him. Catching a glimpse of his bare chest beneath his robe, Reinhardt flushed instantly. She frantically used her entire body to signal that he should cover himself up. Syian seemed puzzled for a moment, but a smile soon spread across his face as he watched her. Leaning closer, he playfully asked if she wanted to share his bed that night. Reinhardt froze, completely baffled by his intentions. He laughed at her reaction and clarified, "You can wear your pajamas, of course," which only made her blush even more deeply. That night, just as before, Reinhardt found herself lying beside the prince, her head resting on the pillow next to his. Sleep was impossible. She simply couldn't take her eyes off him. Eventually, Syian sensed her gaze and softly asked if she was still awake, startling her into a panic. She immediately pretended to be asleep, curling into a ball and remaining perfectly still. But the prince gently pointed out that she always reverted to her human form while sleeping, a detail that made it obvious she was awake and had completely slipped her mind. How could she have forgotten something so important? Syian sighed softly before confessing that ever since she started sharing his bed, his nightmares had completely stopped. He gently stroked her fur, whispering that even though it was late to say it, he was truly happy she was with him. In response, she gave him a soft kiss on the tip of his nose. She felt the exact same way. But since she couldn't speak, that single kiss had to convey all her feelings as they both enjoyed the quiet comfort of each other's company. She silently thanked him for staying by her side. Now in her human form, she was sleeping peacefully in his arms, yet even in her dreams, one thought lingered. She never wanted to part ways with him. The next morning, Syian, dressed in a more formal suit, stood with his arms crossed, clearly irritated that Valaine was running late. The mage finally arrived, apologizing and explaining that he had to sneak past the guards, before asking if Syian hadn't brought the cat along. Just then, a tiny paw peeked out. Reinhardt gave them a little wave. Valaine questioned why she was hiding when no one else was around, but looking down, Syian simply said it was because she was shy. So shy, he claimed, that she would tremble with embarrassment, even from inside his pocket. Her mind, however, was still racing, trying to process what on earth had happened last night. Syian covered his face with his hand as she continued to squirm in his pocket. Getting the hint, he quietly assured her that he wouldn't say a word to the others. Irena was the last to arrive, offering her own apology for the delay. Finally, with the group complete, they were ready to leave. Turning to them, Syian issued a warning. This was not going to be an easy trip. Then, in the blink of an eye, they teleported to the Imperial Archives, where Syian was immediately stunned by how weak the security was. He couldn't believe a place that held the Imperial family's deepest secrets was so vulnerable. Herod explained that there were numerous magical blind spots and weaknesses in the palace's defenses. That comment made the prince uneasy, but he declared it was something he would be sure to fix once he became emperor. He then ordered everyone to find anything related to cats. And so, their search began. While digging through the shelves, Herod remarked that although the palace's defenses were weak, they had done an excellent job of hiding documents. Syian snapped back at him, irritated, telling him not to insult the Empire. When asked, Valaine reported that he hadn't sensed any magical tomes so far. Their only option was to keep looking and try harder. Crawling out of Syian's pocket, Reinhardt was stunned by the massive sea of books and shelves. She thought it would take an eternity to examine everything. Ina spotted her daughter and asked if she had found anything yet. Sadly, Reinhardt could only manage a quiet, negative meow. Ina was clutching a heavy tome about prayers from the great empire of Hubard when Valaine suddenly told them to wait. He could feel a strange energy radiating from the book. Syian didn't think the content seemed particularly special, but as he read further, he began to realize it might be a prophecy. It spoke of someone who had stolen precious souls, who would spend 8 days in darkness and then welcome the 9th night. The maid suddenly gasped. This was the exact prophecy she had heard years ago. Her mother once told her that she was the 8th child, and if this was the prophecy she remembered, then the 9th child was none other than her own little Reinhardt. The cat couldn't believe it. Was she really the 9th child of prophecy? She decided to double-check the text, thinking she might have missed something vital. Suddenly, the book began to glow as a radiant beam of light burst forth from its pages. When she touched it, Reinette heard a voice as if she were being pulled into the book's very essence. The voice asked, "Can you hear me, child?" She was now inside the book. Someone had sealed their power within it, hoping to one day tell their story to the child of the ninth night, should they ever come to hear it. Realizing this wasn't about the future, the cat deduced it was a message from the past. It turned out Reinette's arrival in this world had been prophesied. She was the chosen one, destined to save the Empire. This felt utterly wrong, as the prophecy clearly stated that cats were meant to be the Empire's destroyers, not its saviors. Furthermore, her curse was unlike any other cat's. The voice, however, claimed this very difference was the proof. Reinette was the ninth child, and within that bizarre book-like space, she was tasked with finding the true, damaged prophecy. Adrift in the void, she felt utterly disoriented, with no clue who was speaking to her, or where to even begin her search. The voice then revealed that Reinette was shielded by a divine blessing, granting her the power to set everything right. It implored her to uncover the original manuscript, shatter the chains of her curse, and put an end to all the suffering. It added that if she ever encountered its descendant, she was to help them foresee the future. And with that, the voice abruptly bid her farewell and wished her luck as multiple faint voices began to echo in the distance, like incomprehensible static. Gradually, Reinette's consciousness returned, and she awoke to the sound of the prince shouting her name, her eyes heavy with sleep. He was immensely relieved to see she was all right. She had been unconscious for quite some time. Verlaine chimed in, noting that both she and His Highness had lost consciousness at the same time. Now that she was awake, Syian declared it was time for a full explanation. Meanwhile, in the background, the Duke and his son exchanged hushed words. Herod remarked that someone must have poured their entire magical essence into that book, a feat only the most high-ranking archpriest could even attempt, and based on everything that they were discussing, a particular name began to surface. Syian and Reinette exchanged a wide-eyed glance. The prince then voiced the question on everyone's mind. Who could it possibly be? It was then explained that the original prophetic scroll was damaged just 1 week after its creation. The priest who perished while protecting it was a man named Fabian Nellis. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. He was most likely the one who left that final message. Reinette realized this must have been the man who contacted her, from within the book. At that moment, Syian rose to his feet, his expression resolute. He had made a decision. When questioned, he announced their new mission. They would find the descendant of Fabian Nellis. Regardless of where he was or who he had become, they would find him. 5 days after that solemn vow, their carriage rumbled down the road. Thanks to Verlaine's efforts, they had located the boy with surprising speed. Though they were nearing their destination, Reinette's expression was far from pleased, a fact Syian immediately noticed. Something was clearly troubling her, so he asked what was wrong. The source of her discomfort was painfully obvious. Syian had forced her to wear a pair of bunny ears, which were apparently meant to serve as a disguise for her tail as well. The prince, however, saw no issue with this. Since she was a cat, being out in the open was dangerous, so in his mind, it made perfect sense for her to pose as his pet bunny. He nonchalantly asked for her opinion, but Reinette could only tremble with pure shame. This was, without question, the most mortifying moment of her entire life. Her attempt at a protesting meow only sent Syian into a fit of laughter. He found the whole situation absolutely priceless. Upon arriving at their destination, Syian was visibly taken aback. The descendant of Fabian was supposed to be 16 years old, yet this place reeked of stale liquor and was overrun with rats. Verlaine, however, confirmed this and was indeed the correct address. The moment Herod pushed the door open, they witnessed a man violently shoving a young boy into a corner. The boy shouted, demanding the money he was owed. His assailant merely scoffed and told him to get lost. Syian stood frozen in disbelief. That boy. That was the descendant of Fabian Nellis. Herod grimly confirmed it. He was the last one alive. His name was Syian Nellis. As the boy and the drunkard continued their heated argument, the man's fist flew towards him, but just as it was about to connect, a sharp crack echoed through the room. Sanua blinked, completely bewildered by what had just occurred. The prince had intervened, his hand clamped firmly around the man's head as he slammed him to the floor. Syian then told the boy he would give the drunkard 100 gold coins. Turning his gaze down to the man, he added coldly, "If 10 coins buys you the right To strike someone, then for 100, I should be permitted to snap your neck. He shoved the man away with a final, chilling warning that if he ever laid a hand on anyone again, he'd be searching for his own head rolling across the floorboards. Later that day, after removing Sanua from that squalid den, they made sure he had a proper meal. It was obvious the boy was famished. Syian urged him to eat slower, gently addressing him as Sanua Nellis. The boy paused and looked up, completely baffled. Who in the world is that? For heaven's sake, just call me Jack. Syian arched an eyebrow. So, that's the name you go by? Yep, the boy affirmed. Jack. From the safety of Syian's pocket, Reinhardt cautiously peeked out, still skeptical that this boy could truly be the heir of a legendary archmage. Once he'd eaten his fill, Jack finally broke the silence. All right, so what is it you people want with me? Anyway, after all, they had helped him out and even given him a meal. But Jack wasn't the type to accept charity. He made it clear to the prince that he was prepared to return the favor, as long as Syian told him what he needed. Remaining silent, Syian simply gestured to Herod, who stepped forward and asked the boy if he knew anything about a child whose life was inverted, where day was night and night was day. Jack just stared back, utterly bewildered by the question, as an awkward silence fell over the room. They pressed on, asking about family heirlooms or special stories passed down from his parents. But Jack came up empty. Looking thoroughly defeated, Herod informed His Highness that the boy was completely clueless. Syian rose from the table, declaring it was time to leave, and ordered Herod to wipe Jack's memory. He then instructed Velen to begin searching for another of Nellis's descendants. Jack was stunned. Wait, what's going on? He demanded. As they began to leave, Syian told him they would make sure he was paid enough to live comfortably, considering his family's past sacrifices for the Empire, which had even produced a great priest. Jack, however, snapped. He shot back that he didn't want their handout. He insisted he only made honest deals, and who in the hell gave them the right to mess with his memories, anyway? From the confines of Syian's pocket, Reinhardt wondered aloud if it was safe to assume that if he inherited nothing, their trail had officially gone cold. Jack cut in, exclaiming that he never got a single thing from his family, not even a name. He'd left all of that in the past. His words sparked an idea in Reinhardt's mind. What if the inheritance, passed down from Nellis, wasn't an item or a story? What if it was the bloodline itself? Suddenly, it all made sense. She had a plan. With a nimble leap, Reinhardt sprang from Syian's pocket. Jack yelped. What the hell was that? A rabbit or a cat? Tossing aside her bunny ears mid-sprint, Reinhardt launched herself directly at the boy and sank her teeth into his cheek. She needed his blood, the blood of the Nellis lineage. Jack let out a shriek loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. In that instant, everything changed. Reinhardt felt her perspective shift as long silver strands of hair fell into her vision. Jack looked up and froze, the bite on his cheek still stinging. Before him was no longer a cat, but a girl. Both of them were paralyzed in total shock, with Reinhardt still on top of him. Right on cue, the overprotective prince swooped in. Syian pulled Reinhardt off by the waist, warning her not to get any closer to that boy. He immediately draped his jacket over her, covering her from view. Jack was still shouting in disbelief. A cat just turned into a person. This isn't happening. How is everyone so calm about this? Reinhardt was a bit shaken. The boy was entirely too loud and had been uncomfortably close. Herod stepped up behind Jack and quieted him. Velen then turned to Reinhardt and asked how she had possibly guessed that would work. Beaming proudly, she explained, "There's one inheritance that can't be stolen, broken, or lost to time. It's the people, the bloodline itself." Velen nodded, realizing the high priest Nellis must have passed the key through his own lineage. Finally, the gravity of what had happened dawned on Jack. The cat was now a human, thanks to him. He smugly demanded a proper reward for his part, only for the mages to tell him to shut up. Off to the side, Syian quietly observed Reinhardt in her human form. She turned to him and asked why Herod and Jack were in the next room. The prince explained that it was because of all the noise they were making. Now, it was just the two of them, sitting at a table with cups of tea. Syian casually asked why she had bitten Jack specifically on the cheek. Scratching her own cheek in embarrassment, she replied that it was simply the first part of him she saw, addressing him formally as, "Your Highness." Syian took a sip of tea before asking why she was suddenly so formal. Blushing, Reinhardt admitted that in her human form, she felt compelled to act, according to her station, seeing as he was the crown prince. Syian murmured something under his breath, about to make a remark on class, but, before he could finish, a loud yell interrupted them. They both jumped in surprise. Reinhardt was on her feet instantly, knowing a shout that loud could only mean something was wrong. Her bare feet had only just met the floor when Syian intercepted her, halting her before a second step could be taken. He then swept her into his embrace, and completely flustered by the sudden movement, she asked. She insisted he put her down, but he gently urged her to stay still, pointing out that her feet were bare. Quite why she couldn't walk barefoot and required the prince to carry her is a mystery we may never solve. Moments later, Herod burst into the room with tears streaming down his face, begging His Highness to save him. Jack, however, seemed utterly baffled by the mage's dramatic reaction to a single rat. Herod wailed that he would sooner dive into a pigsty than share the same space as that wretched man. An annoyed Jack pointed out that Herod always became this theatrical whenever a tiny rat scared him. But then, the rat began to move in, perfect sync with others. The boy then yelled to forget the pigsty. He'd toss him into a rat's nest instead. Reinhardt couldn't help but wonder if Jack was somehow orchestrating the rodent's behavior. Just as she thought that, the rats swarmed Herod, who collapsed in utter defeat as his father cried out his name. The room was left in chaos, as if a veritable plague of rats had stormed through it. They said it took an eternity to chase them all out, though Jack insisted that the other fellow had started the whole affair. This only strengthened Reinhardt's suspicion that if her hunch was correct, Sanua's descendant truly possessed the power to command animals. With this realization, she proposed that they bring him along with them. Touching his hand, she explained that Swana had a special gift, which immediately prompted Jack to grumble about being called that name again. Observing them both, Syian asked Reinhardt if Swana could genuinely control rats. Jack interjected, pleading for them to stop using that bizarre name. Reinhardt then asked if he was aware of his family's lineage. She elaborated that the Swana family had produced generations of powerful priests who had made immense sacrifices for the Empire. Leaning closer, she whispered to Jack that he was born into this very family. He retorted that he wasn't the one responsible for any of that. Still, Reinhardt suspected his powers might be even greater than they imagined and pressed on, asking if he wasn't the least bit curious to discover the full extent of his abilities. Jack's surprise only grew when she declared that he was the only one who could help her, adding that he could aid countless other people as well. A heavy silence hung in the air for a moment before an abashed Jack quietly asked that if he proved to be useless, would Reinhardt promise not to take back her words. She took his hand, gave a firm nod, and with a grateful smile, assured him she wouldn't. Just as Jack was about to protest the name Swana once more, he noticed something was wrong. Reinhardt's vision began to swim, the world tilting as if the ground itself was unsteady. She saw Jack's face looming larger and larger. Clinging to the boy's hand to keep from falling, she wondered if she had reverted to a cat. Speaking with Valen, the mage, and Syian both reached the same conclusion. She was, indeed, a cat once more. The prince demanded to know why she had changed back, and Valen explained he had a theory, suggesting it could be due to a sudden, massive drain on Sanua's energy. Pinching the boy's shirt between his fingertips as if it were contaminated, Herod called him an ungrateful whelp. Syian commented that they would have to wait for the boy to recover his strength before they could test his abilities again. Dukion concurred, acknowledging there was little else to be done for now. Meanwhile, the two youths were still glaring daggers at each other in the background like a pair of petulant children. The prince decided the best course of action was to leave Sanua at the Duan estate and instructed them to notify him as soon as the boy's strength returned. For the time being, he and Reinhardt would return to the palace. Back at the imperial estate, Arena spotted the prince's carriage from a window, wondering if their journey had been successful in breaking the curse. Her thoughts were interrupted when another maid approached, calling her name. Arena turned, startled. The woman informed her that she was being summoned to the reception room, adding with some hesitation that the summons came from Countess Gisela herself. At the mention of that name, Arena froze in terror, wondering what the Countess could possibly want with her. Syian, already exasperated by the day's events, found he had more matters to attend to upon his return. He gently asked the cat how she was feeling. Reinhardt attempted to say she was fine, but the moment her tiny dress was off, she collapsed onto the bed in a heap, clearly and utterly exhausted. Gently stroking her fur, the prince promised he would return shortly and told her to rest. Just then, a knock came from the bedroom door, and the prince bid them enter. Irina stepped inside, apologizing for the intrusion but explaining she had something urgent to report. Both Syian and the cat turned to look at her. A short while later, Syian was seething. He was furious that the countess had dared to approach Irina and attempt to coerce her into spying on him. Removing his glasses, he strode from the room. As the door clicked shut behind him, Syian muttered that there was no one left in the palace he could trust. The place was utterly draining. As he walked down the corridor, a thought crossed his mind. There was still one soul he could truly trust. Arriving at the room, he was struck by the unusual silence. His expression turned grave. Then, from the quiet, a soft meow broke the tension. Reinhardt instantly bounded toward him, her delight at his return unmistakable. A gentle smile graced his features. Syian carefully scooped the cat into his arms, suggesting they go for a walk. And so, that evening, they ventured out into the garden. The prince murmured, asking if she was enjoying herself, and Reinhardt responded with a contented meow, absolutely loving their stroll. The trees were bathed in a silvery blue moonlight, while the lake shimmered, creating a breathtaking view. This cool yet gentle scenery reminded her so much of Syian. As they sat on the grass, the prince announced he had something for her, presenting a small envelope. He explained that it was a letter from her mother, Irina, with a trace of sadness in his tone. He relayed that she had already departed and couldn't say a proper farewell, so she had entrusted him with delivering this to her daughter. He also mentioned that the maid had been concerned for Reinhardt throughout the entire journey. Gazing at Syian, Reinhardt sensed he was likely reflecting on his own, her mother's letter. He seemed so melancholic. She gently placed her paws on him, an instinctive gesture of comfort. A faint smile touched his lips as he said she always knew just how to soothe his spirit. He theorized that the reason his nightmares had ceased must be due to some special ability of hers. But Reinhardt, feeling doubtful, thought that wasn't likely the case. As pleasant as the idea was, she couldn't believe she'd suddenly developed such powers. The prince fell silent for a moment, and then, to her, utter astonishment, Syian began to remove his shirt. Reinhardt immediately shielded her eyes with her paws, but the prince urged her to look. Hesitantly, Reinhardt began to peek through her paws. He insisted that he wanted her to see for herself. To her absolute shock, every single scar on his body had vanished. He could have simply shown her how the one on his hand was disappearing. But no, she figured he was deliberately teasing her by taking off his entire shirt. The prince then playfully chided her, saying, if she stared any more intensely, she might just burn a hole right through him, which only made her flush a deeper shade of red. In any case, he began to explain that he'd noticed this strange change since they started sleeping in proximity to one another. More precisely, since they'd been spending more time together. She was stunned. It was only a theory, he conceded. Perhaps it was all a remarkable coincidence. But even if it wasn't her power, Syian assured her that she was still incredibly special to him. A wave of happiness washed over her at his words. She couldn't explain why, but his words were deeply comforting. It meant that even if she were just an ordinary cat, she would still hold a special place in his heart. Back at the palace, Syian was met by the butler. The prince inquired what business they had with him at such a late hour. Looking somewhat apprehensive, the staff member presented him with a box of cookies. With his arms crossed and a skeptical expression, the prince relayed that the servants claimed the cookies were a gift from Countess Gisela. Reinhardt visibly flinched at the name, immediately recoiling from the box of sweets. Her entire posture screamed a warning that he absolutely should not eat them. And just like that, Syian's suspicions were piqued. Something was definitely amiss. The cat knew with absolute certainty, if anyone were to send tainted cookies, it would be Countess Gisela. The prince paused, standing in silence for a long moment. Then he called Reinhardt's name, and she lifted a paw in acknowledgement. He asked if she recalled what he'd said earlier, about his theory concerning her unique ability. The cat let out a dubious meow, as if questioning his sanity. But as he reached for the cookies, he announced his decision to eat just one to put his theory to the test. After taking a bite, he declared they would soon discover if he was plagued by nightmares. That night, Reinhardt was aghast at what she could only describe as a world-class display of recklessness. As he casually licked his fingers, Syian offered her a smile. In her head, Reinhardt was frantic. Why in the world would he eat that? Later that night, the prince lay in bed, deep in slumber. Gently touching his forehead, Reinhardt felt a wave of relief wash over her. He seemed perfectly fine, with no signs of any nightmares. She had been worried sick ever since that brilliant fool decided to eat the cookie. She prayed the rest of the night would remain peaceful. A wave of drowsiness came over her, and she began to drift off to sleep. But then, suddenly, a vision flooded her mind. She was holding a dagger, its blade stained crimson with blood. A jolt of shock ran through her as she wondered why she was even holding such a weapon. Then, she looked up and saw who she had stabbed. Syian. The name echoed in her mind as panic seized her, and she couldn't grasp what was happening. Her heart hammered against her ribs as her vision blurred, and several accusing voices swirled around her. They branded her as cursed, the child destined to bring ruin to the Hubard Empire, the one who would end everyone. With a sharp gasp, Reinhardt jolted awake, breathless, realizing it had all been a terrible dream. She immediately turned over. Syian was right beside her, sleeping soundly and perfectly fine. He didn't seem plagued by any nightmares, which meant she must have taken them all upon herself. That could only signify that he'd been enduring those horrific nightmares this entire time, even before she appeared. Pushed to the edge and trapped by her fear, a chilling thought emerged. That dark magic potion knew exactly how to torment its victims, painting her as a monster fated to destroy the Empire. Those words preyed on her deepest insecurity, the terrifying possibility that she might truly be that creature. Overwhelmed with despair, she tried to deny it, but she couldn't halt the invasive thoughts. Besides, if she really had the power to repel nightmares, why had it only started working just now? The next day, Syian was busy writing a document while the cat sat primly on his desk. After a while, the young man asked Reinhardt if she was truly feeling okay. She looked utterly exhausted, so he wondered if she hadn't slept well, but the cat tried to deny it. He stared at her in silence for a moment before asking again, "If it wasn't sleep, then what's going on?" He had noticed she kept drifting off. She kept dozing off in little naps every so often. Reinhardt gestured toward the window, attempting to blame the bright sunlight, which made Syian raise an eyebrow. He asked with skepticism if she was seriously blaming the weather. She insisted it was the truth, but despite the strange sleepiness, her head was spinning and she found it difficult to breathe. That's when Syian sensed something was genuinely wrong. An overwhelming weakness washed over her, and she began to lose consciousness. Worried, the young man moved closer. He called out her name as she started to topple off the desk, but just in time, he caught her. Instead of a cat, it was a girl now resting in his arms. The young man called her name again, and as she slowly opened her eyes, she realized she had transformed back into a human. That's when she also realized something else. She wasn't wearing a single thing. In a flash, Syian spun around and took off his coat, handing it to her without looking as his entire face turned a brilliant shade of red. He told her to put it on while he kept his back turned to her. She wrapped herself in his coat and thanked him, still blushing furiously, then told him he could turn back around. When he did, he found Reinhardt completely bundled up in a blanket on the couch, which made him burst into laughter. Embarrassed, she asked why he was laughing, turning dead serious in an instant. Syian simply replied, "Laughing about what?" A response that only annoyed her more. The first thing the prince did was check for any messages about Reinhardt. He asked if the Duke had any inkling that this sort of thing might happen. Opening a small box with a magical artifact inside, Syian said that wasn't quite the case. However, they had prepared some precautions. He had a magic circle installed inside the top drawer of his desk for the purpose of direct communication. The prince continued, saying the mages had just reported that Sina had used his powers again, so perhaps there really was a connection between those powers and Ray's transformations. But just as he was about to ask something else, he noticed the girl had vanished. Only the blanket she had been wrapped in was left on the couch. He shouted her name in a panic and yanked the blanket away, only to find the cat fast asleep. She had transformed again. For a second, the young man froze in utter confusion. With a serious expression, he thought, if she was asleep, why did she turn back into a cat? In the letter, the mages had written that they suspected using his powers triggered side effects. Syian thought that made sense as he bit his hand in slight anxiety, but maybe it wasn't him. Perhaps the potion was affecting the cat directly instead. How he even knew about the potion when Reinhardt had never told him was anyone's guess. Let's just say the plot required it. Syian replied to the letter, stating he would appreciate it if the mages could investigate further. It could be the influence of the magic potion, after all. However, the Duke warned it was far too risky to pursue at the moment, especially since Valane had been visiting the palace more frequently as of late. Any strange moves could easily spark suspicion from His Majesty. The prince replied that if the Duke couldn't come to him, then he would just go there himself. He got up and started to put his clothes back on. On the way, Syian wondered if perhaps he was just dreaming too much. He thought about how every living thing that had ever gotten close to him eventually met a certain fate. Left. As fate would have it, the young prince ran directly into the Emperor and Countess Gisela, who was draped elegantly on Adolf's arm. Gisela immediately questioned where he could possibly be going at such a late hour. The prince's hand instinctively tightened around Retta in his pocket as he offered a greeting to His Majesty. The Emperor idly wondered if he was leaving, a sentiment the Countess echoed. She added that the hour was indeed quite late. Syian calmly stated he was making his way to Claude City, then his eyes fixed on the blood-soaked sack a guard was holding as he asked what was inside. Adolf replied with a dismissive air that it was a fox cub he'd just hunted, explaining that Catherine had been frightened when the creature darted out in the garden. The woman chimed in, smiling sweetly at the prince, saying she only screamed because she'd mistaken it for a cat. The Emperor added that she was easily startled. He continued that it was a profound relief, it wasn't a cat. The prince's gaze turned to cold steel. He thought to himself, no matter. One day he would personally tear this man apart, piece by agonizing piece, with his own 2 hands. Syian then observed coolly that the sack seemed unusually large for just one small fox. Suddenly, the Emperor's hand landed heavily on his shoulder. A twisted grin spread across Adolf's face as he recounted how the mother fox had rushed in when he'd cornered the cub, leading all her other babies straight to their doom. He began to mock her. He jeered at her futile attempt to fight back, sneering that she had only succeeded in condemning her entire litter. Syian's heart hammered in his chest. His loathing for that man, for all of humanity, boiled within him. The memory of his mother, caged in a forgotten corner of the palace, flooded his mind. It felt as if they were taunting him with this very story, fighting for control. He asked if the hunt had at least proven satisfying. The Emperor laughed, calling it ridiculous to even label it a hunt. It was merely a bit of evening amusement. In that case, the prince declared, he would be sure to prepare some proper entertainment for their next gathering. Adolf raised a curious eyebrow, asking for clarification, what he could possibly mean. And with a chilling smile, Syian promised to arrange a hunt the likes of which neither the Emperor nor the Countess had ever experienced before. He then added a condition. He would do so, of course, only with their permission. Smiling back, Gisela readily agreed, saying she was already looking forward to it. With a low chuckle, Syian bid them farewell and turned to leave. After offering a final, curt goodbye to the Emperor, Syian strode toward the exit, breaking into a full-speed gallop the moment he was clear of the palace grounds. His resolve was forged in iron. He would never again lose anyone who belonged to him, and anyone who dared to stand in his path would be cut down without a second thought. Back inside the palace, Catherine walked beside the Emperor, silently passing judgment on the prince's claim of heading to Claude City so late in the evening. The whole story had a rather unseemly flavor. A low-born woman of stunning beauty, a maid who had vanished without a single trace. If, by some chance, the prince was the one hiding her away from the world, then all the pieces suddenly fit. She turned to His Majesty and announced there was something she desired. The Emperor, brimming with his usual arrogance, told her to simply ask. Whatever she wanted, it was as good as hers. Meanwhile, the villainess was lost in her own dark thoughts. The poor fool, she mused. He doesn't even comprehend that the more desperately he tries to conceal something he loves. Just then, she asked the Emperor to tell her where the fox cub had been found. She completed her thought. The more I want to unearth it and seize what he cherishes most. And that's the cliffhanger, everyone. What did you think of that dramatic turn? I am completely obsessed. This fierce little kitten and her devoted, protective prince. I cannot wait to watch their romance deepen. If you loved the story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next video and the continuation of this saga. We have just concluded Chapter 20 of this incredible series titled The Possessive Tyrant and His Sleepy Cat. Kisses to you all, and I will see you next time.